Hello, I'm Sophia Huyer, and I'm the leader of the Gender and Social Inclusion Flagship for the CGIAR Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security. I'm very happy to welcome you to this session on implementing policy and institutional changes that enable transformation, part of this ongoing virtual event, A New Era for Food and Climate, Driving Transformative Actions. If you're new to this session, let me tell you that this around the world virtual relay has been organized to launch the flagship report, Actions to Transform Food Systems Under Climate Change, part of the global initiative on transforming food systems under climate change that's organized by CCAFs with over 100 partners. The aim is to achieve a transformation in food systems through mobilizing knowledge and catalyzing action. A slide will come up with information on where you can download that report. The action area from this report that we are highlighting here is about achieving policy reforms to encourage sustainable, inclusive, healthy, and climate resilient food systems, including agricultural subsidies and better access to markets for small-scale producers and businesses, all while addressing trade barriers and power disparities in food systems. There are four key strategies to achieve these policy and institutional reforms. The first is participatory scenario building with policy actors, producers, and consumers. This is done with the goal to integrate diverse perspectives on what is needed to build sustainable food systems. The second strategy is tailored support to countries to enable them to take on a reform agenda. This includes smart information and communications to establish consensus for reform, technical assistance to identify important policy reforms and priority actions, as well as potential mechanisms and models for implementation. The third area is advancing gender equality and social inclusion by integrating the views of women, youth, and marginalized peoples into decision-making, finance, and policy, working with women, farmers, and youth organizations, and recognizing that women and youth are active agents in climate adaptation and mitigation, all while taking into account inequalities in rights, resources, decision-making, and opportunities. And finally, the fourth area is about collaborative learning on policy successes between different regions, building on opportunities for countries to learn from each other. Today, we have four speakers who will present different models for policy and institutional reform for sustainable, healthy, and inclusive food systems in these four strategy areas. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Ruben Echeverria, a member of the report's panel of experts who will be our facilitator today. Dr. Echeverria is Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and former Director General of the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. Before handing over to Dr. Echeverria, who will introduce our panelists, I'd like to call your attention to the audience Q&A later in the session, where we hope to interact with all of you. To ask a question for our panelists, sorry, I'm lost here. To ask a question of our panelists, you will need to download the Huyer app and you can see the instructions on the slide. To access this event on the Huyer app, enter the email address you used for the event registration and create a password. If it doesn't automatically show up on the app, you'll need to search for A New Era for Food and Climate, and then click the button that says Join on the bottom of the event description page. And you can then enter the invitation code you have or request a new code. Please submit your questions to us. We look forward to receiving them. And now I will hand it over to Dr. Echeverria.
Many thanks, Sophia, and thank you to CCAFs and all friends and partners of climate change transformation. I think we have a great panel ahead. And before I introduce the three panelists, I would just in a couple of minutes try to frame a little of this session, which I am biased. I think this is one of the most important sessions through the report, because this is a fantastic report. It has actions, not only recommendations for people to read and forget. We are getting into the actions here. So you have seen, for those of you who have read and memorized perhaps the whole report, or you will do that soon, you have all the previous sections talking about how to redirect actions, as Sophia said, how to prevent land expansion, how to promote incentives, how to de-risk, how to reduce emissions. All of that is the previous part of the report. This section is I think is key because it considers the top bottlenecks for impact, which is realigning policies, finance, social change, and of course, innovation. So I said it's a fantastic report, and I may be biased, but I think because of the actions, our session is one of these 11 actions in the report. How we are going to implement, not the policies that we need, but how we are going to implement these policies, and the most important part of institutional change. Policy doesn't come in a vacuum. It has to happen some institutional change in the background, as you all know. So creating this enabling environment that we all aspire to incentivize action, foster innovative solutions. We don't want to go back to the past. We have done a lot of mistakes. How to build a level, very easy playing field is essential for this transformation and the climate change. Now, the policy and institutional actions are core to achieving all the other actions. So we usually, for those of you who read reports, we leave the policy and institutional change at the end of reports. I don't know, it's a tradition, we leave it for the end. So I am an optimist, and I think it's not because it's less important than the other actions, it's because without the policy and institutional change, we won't be able to achieve all the other actions. How we are going to realign policies and institutions. This is the focus of this panel. So we have three main outcomes that we want. It's very clear in the report. We want three outcomes. We don't want 300 from this action. One is the policy reforms on the subsidies, the public subsidies, how we are going to incentivize private sector investment to support sustainable food systems that we all want. A second one is to improve the access to markets, still very key, and the operational environment. And of course, to reduce trade barriers. That's what we want. Those are the outcomes from as we implement this. Now, the targets, and this is again, I'm finishing with this framing on the targets because I think this is the beauty of the report. It has three very important targets, which is how we are going to realign, and we are going to discuss this in the panel in a moment, how we are going to realign 300 billion with a B of US dollars of ag subsidies to a climate change, how to realign that to a climate change. This is the amount of 16 OECD countries. There's much more subsidies out there, but this is just the amount of that, 300 billion. How we can do that? That's a target, we need to do it. How to improve the business environment in 24 sub-Saharan African countries. How to ease that environment so all of this can be realigned and transformed. And finally, how to improve resilience in a score of 49 countries. These are big, big targets. Now, and we only have 5 years. So anyway, it's better to get going on this one. So we are ready to discuss. That's what this session is all about. And let me introduce the three fantastic panelists that we have for this session. We have Martien Frick from Germany. He's from the United Nations. He's currently a United Nations Deputy Special Envoy for the Food System Summit of 2021. How about that? We don't want another summit. We want the summit. And we have Martien, which is a special envoy for that. He's one of our panel members. Then we have the Honorable Winifred Masiko from Uganda, a director of Skills Gallery Limited, a consulting company. But more importantly, she's a member of the African Group of Negotiators on Climate Change. So we need those negotiators, otherwise it won't happen. And our third panelist is Martien van Nieuwkoop from the Netherlands, and currently the Global Director for the Agriculture and Food Global Practice in the World Bank. So three fantastic panelists. I'm sure they're ready for my first round of questions. We are all behaving here. We have a couple of minutes for each answer. And then we are going to have go back to a second round. And we want to, Sophia, we want to really leave space for questions and answers that you are going to feel from the audience. So can I start with Martien? I will say Martien Frick to make sure, because I have two Martins in the panel. So Martien, in your planning, you're working hard and for the summit for 2021. In your planning for that food system summit, how do you plan to address issues of equity, inclusion, climate justice, even climate conflict, vulnerable people, gender? What key themes and stakeholders will be included? Everybody wants to be in that summit, Martien. So you have a tough choice of filtering and prioritizing. What are the key themes your team is thinking of getting into the summit agenda?
Thank you, Ruben. That's a big question. How much time do you give me to answer?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Oh dear. Well, let me go really fast. I have been working on climate justice since 2007, and I take some pride of being one of the people who helped socializing the concept. And if we agree by now that climate justice is the imperative and that climate change is a moral question more than anything else, then the question is, how do you produce climate justice? And my simple and fast answer would be, you produce climate justice by finally giving smallholder farmers the recognition and the support and the money, let's speak about the M word, that they are really deserve. Because 830 million food insecure on this planet, 80% of them are smallholder farmers. That is just absurd. And if you need any proof that our food systems are broken, then it is this. So a food systems summit. And I'm really personally excited to working on that for a simple reason. I have been spending my last 2.5 years in the climate change secretariat, and we have not achieved yet to look into a systemic issue of food systems and their impact of climate change. And if we would do that and put everything together, then we are looking at the single biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and certainly the most heavy hit sector and the most relevant sector for the achievement of the SDGs, period. And in order to get the attention that is needed, we need to get people out of silos. You cannot have a discussion about something as big only with the Minister of Environment, only with the Minister of Agriculture, only with the Minister of Health. And I think the first big thing that we really want to achieve is we are bringing that to a heads of state and government level. We're going up the government pyramid because on the top you can really ensure this coordination. And then secondly, I think this will not just be a summit moment, a day in our lives in which something is happening, but we really want to engage over 1.5 years also, for example, with dialogues about food systems in every single member state of the United Nations. That's a very big ask. So it's one thing then that people have this conversation.
2 minutes are gone, so if you can just...
Okay, I wrap up. If you do these conversations in countries, that's a good thing in itself. My hope would be that these conversations not least land in the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement that can only work and can only be ambitious if they are really done also with food systems, with an all of society engagement. And sorry for going a little bit over time.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you. We all hope that all of that will be there. Thank you, Martien. Winnie, we have you are in a special group. You are in the group of the African negotiators. So my question to you is, what role has the gender group in the African group of negotiators on climate played in global and regional climate policy? Can you provide 1 or 2 examples, but all of that in 2 minutes? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. The African Group of Negotiators Expert Support, AGNES, was created in 2015 to provide scientific expertise and evidence-based information to the African Group of Negotiators. It brings together policymakers, negotiators, and scientists to develop and defend positions that the negotiators use to discuss the different areas, especially in agriculture and gender. The gender group in the AGNES has been very active in especially creating room to build the capacity of the negotiators in the area of gender and agriculture. It has carried out so many studies and has been able to support the African Group of Negotiators with papers that have been requested by the UNFCCC, especially in the Gender Action Plan. Right at the beginning of the formation of the Gender Action Plan, the developing countries or parties were supposed to submit some documents on how best they want the gender action plan to look like. And Agnes, the gender group in Agnes, worked very hard, carried out several studies, and came out with positions that they forwarded to the African group of negotiators, which they submitted. It has been doing a lot of work in the production of different well-researched policy papers, and it has also participated in engendering the NDCs, the national climate actions, especially in the African continent, as well as making sure that the programs like the leadership program on climate change is engendered. So the African group of negotiators, the gender group in the African group of negotiators has been very active to make sure that they amplify the issue of gender in the negotiations.
Okay, thank you, Winnie. Thank you for staying on the 2 minutes. Martien, we are coming back to you now, and how can public subsidies? We are not against public subsidies, but we want to realign. How can public subsidies encourage private sector to invest? We want an inclusive, climate resilient food system. So how can we promote? How we can advocate for that? We want to realign only $300 billion. So what's your take on this one?
Well, thanks very much, Ruben, and it's a very important question, and I agree with you. I mean, that this chapter probably is the most important chapter of the very excellent report. I would actually argue that our analysis actually shows that if it includes also the public support to agricultural developing country, part 2 countries, the total envelope actually is not 300, but $570 billion. And our argument is, our position actually is that this 570 billion is part of the climate problem. If you ask yourself what's the effectiveness and efficiency of those resources, this public support, basically it's a waste of money. If you look at the FOLU report that came out last year, looking at the hidden cost of the global food system, the conclusion is actually that if you factor in the health cost, the environmental cost, the global food system actually is subtracting rather than adding value. $12 trillion in cost, $10 trillion in market value. And this with 570 billion in public support. So clearly, I mean, those resources can be used much better. In order to generate a global food system by 2030 that is sustainable, nutritious, and affordable, about $300 to $350 billion in annual investments are required. This is about half of the 570 billion. So the question is, can we actually repurpose the existing public support? And we'll give a huge boost. And also our analysis shows actually that investing in climate smart agriculture by farmers, I mean, generates a lot of triple win benefits. I mean, you can simultaneously increase productivity, enhance resilience, and reduce the carbon footprint. And we particularly think, I mean, that investing in soil health is a big winner. Good soil health, and all farmers will agree to that, is good for productivity. The water retention capacity of the soil improves resilience. And at the same time, good and healthy soils, I mean, provide opportunities for carbon sequestration. So actually, healthy soils are a global public good and therefore justify putting public money behind it. So the idea is actually that in the 21st century, why not actually reward farmers, I mean, to provide those ecosystem services, redefine what it means to be a farmer, not just a producer of food, but also a provider of ecosystem services. And I think if that's being recognized and this $570 billion is put behind it, we can go beyond business as usual to actually transform the global food system where it needs to be, and that actually adds value rather than subtract value. Thanks, Ruben. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Very clear. That's the path. That's the path that we need to advocate for. So I go back to Martien Frick. We are going to start the second round of questions. Everybody's behaving. So Sophia and colleagues, I'm going to have my second round of questions, and then we open for questions and answers. So Martien, how can policy process, this is all about this section of the report, is all about policy and institutional change. How can policy processes ensure that the views of women, youth, indigenous people, marginalized people, vulnerable people are integrated into decision-making processes at all levels within the food system?
Well, let's just start by stating the obvious. They are not integrated in a sufficient way. And I think that is one of the reasons why our food systems are actually failing. You know, we're talking in the economic world about internalities and externalities and the costs that are not being represented in our planning, that are not represented on company spreadsheets. It's sometimes worthwhile asking who is actually paying these costs, who is suffering under what is called externalities. And I can only tell you because precisely these groups are underrepresented, constantly underrepresented. And also, and that's an important point, if we want to achieve change in a climate change world, we need to get those who don't have the ear of the government closer to the government to listen, and those who permanently have the ear of the government maybe getting a step back. And this is why in the preparation of the Food System Summit, we go for great lengths, really to empower these groups that are marginalized and often not heard. And I can only encourage everybody to use the possibilities to nominate champions to be part of the food systems dialogues. And maybe just one thing, we will have these food systems dialogues also in a box as a toolbox that everybody can organize such a food systems dialogue and a possibility to influence. So if you're being ignored, you're not powerless, but you can organize yourself, and we are here to listen. Now I'm under 2 minutes and I hand back to you. So we have made it good for the first intervention.
Thank you, Martin. You have savings. You have savings for anyway. So Winnie, you know, you just heard from Martin. You know, it's very clear, but we cannot wait for the United Nations to solve all our problems of inequality and integration and inclusion, right? So how do national governments prepare? How do we translate these ambitious gender equality and women empowerment goals that you just mentioned in the previous questions and aspirations in the negotiations to concrete actions that transform and stabilize the food systems, and we don't go all the way next year to the food summit with a long list, shopping list of requests for the United Nations. We should be more bottom up. How do national governments? How do you think that happening in the next few months?
Yes, national governments should first and foremost appreciate that the fact of inequality exists in the food systems. They should appreciate this inequality in rights, in resources, opportunities, and decision-making. Once the national governments appreciate that, then there should be deliberate effort to create awareness of these inequalities. Because if the inequalities are not addressed, then the food systems will not work to bring about any meaningful development. So once they appreciate that, they create awareness in the lower levels, in the ministries, departments, and agencies, and all other institutions that focus on food systems and development issues. Once the awareness is created and appreciated, then there should be a deliberate effort to correct sex desegregated data and carry out gender analysis so that the activities that are developed are gender responsive. And of course, there has to be a deliberate bottom-up approach so that right from the grassroots up to the national level, all the voices are captured. And once these voices are captured, there should be a deliberate effort to establish action plans. These action plans should be very elaborate with activities, responsible persons, timelines, and the budget. And of course, there should be adequate funding for these action plans so that they are able to be, they can be implemented. And this bottom-up approach in the development of action plans will go a long way to improve the food systems. At the same time, there should be a robust monitoring and evaluation strategy embedded in these action plans, so that we are able to find out if equality has been promoted. And of course, gender audits. That gender audit should take place, and through gender audit, you are able to find out if the gender responsive activities or programs in the food systems have been appreciated, honored, and worked on.
Yeah, that's 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Winnie. Clear. That's a good list. Don't lose that list. So I go back to my second question to Martien. And Martien, I am old enough to remember from the Uruguay round, we've been discussing how to reduce subsidies, and look what happened. So I know it's almost 600 billion instead of 300 billion. So how can financial tools, how can subsidies and others support not only try to advocate with governments, but also support small and medium-sized producers and food systems startups or accelerators in the food system? How we can redirect and realign without going back to what we have suffered in the last few decades of pushing against subsidies, at least on trade. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ruben. And I think you're pointing out to a very important point there as well, because if the public subsidies or the public support is about $570 billion per year, I mean, the private investments in the food system are about $2 trillion per year. So the question is, what can be done actually to make those investments more inclusive and more environmentally friendly and reduce the carbon footprint? Now, of course, a lot of efforts has been done. I mean, after the food price crisis in 2007 to 2008, I mean, to kind of put in place, I mean, the principles for responsible agricultural investments that take into account, I mean, the local effects of environmental effects and social effects of investments. Those principles are voluntary. So the question is actually, can we move beyond and actually and get to kind of binding business standards? And I think you see a lot of initiatives, and also the bank is putting its weight behind it. I mean, there's a big exercise going on with the World Benchmarking Alliance. I mean, for the major agribusiness companies, about 300, 350, to adopt business standards that actually reflect those. And the idea is that when those are being adopted, that actually will trickle down, I mean, to other agribusinesses as well. This would be very important. Now, but in order for recognizing, I mean, that the investments, private investment in food systems are risky, and that probably because of climate, those risks are increasing. I mean, we need to have mechanisms that actually reduce those risks and risk mitigation measures. So for that reason, I mean, we're looking very carefully about, to what extent could public resources be used, I mean, to provide guarantees to private sector investment to take first loss provisions, for instance. I think that would be a good way, because then ultimately it's still the private sector who takes the decision to invest, but at the same time, it gets a kind of a premium and a support, I mean, to kind of bring the risk down to kind of an acceptable level, and thereby also leveraging, I mean, the public support, I mean, to agriculture, if you take the route of guarantee. So binding business standards and mainstreaming guarantee facilities would be two major ingredients of moving that agenda forward. Thanks.
Okay, very clear. Thank you very much. Great. So with this, your moderator will go back to Sophia, because she's going to field the questions from the audience, and then we are going to come back for a very brief wrap up at the end. So Sophia, please go ahead. I'm sure you have very friendly questions to the panelists.
I do. I have some good questions that have come in for our audience. And so I will start again with Martin Frick and ask him, what strategies are you implementing, or do you consider could be implemented to involve youth in policymaking processes, and or if you prefer to address what will be done around engaging youth in the food summit?
Thank you very much. The strategy is very simple. You engage youth. You don't talk about youth. You're working with them. And if you see our emerging presence in the social media, our Instagram account, for example, you will see already young food ambassadors from all over the planet to work with us. One of the first engagements of the special envoy of Dr. Kalibata was talking to the young United Nations Environmental Assembly. And we will continue on this path. We will have youth champions in our champions network. We are very eager to listen to you. And, just earlier, I've been in the high level panel of the Committee on Food Security. And if they identified some of the key problems of agriculture, then it's the lack of young people. So absolutely engaging, listening, involving young people will be at the core of the summit, and also is what gives me most hope, because in the climate change world, what has been achieved in the last, I would say, 15 months by people under 25 is breathtaking. And it's, you can only say thank you to the young people.
Definitely. Thank you. I agree. Moving on, the next question is for Winifred. And that question is, you've been a negotiator at the UNFCCC now for a few years. You've seen developments in the AGN, Agnes, and in other countries. And what would you say about the trends, what the trends are in terms of women's participation at the global negotiations level and as members of national delegations? And if you have some time, could you also add, what do you think could and should be done in future to increase and maintain a balance of women and potentially even youth as well at the negotiations?
Thank you very much. Yes, I must say that I've been in the negotiations for some time, and my observation is very clear that there has been a steady increase of the number of women in the negotiation. It has increased steadily, and also the issue around in the negotiations, gender and climate change, you realize that there's always a call for increased number of women so that we have a balance in all negotiation tracks. So there has been an increase. However, they still need to be more because, for instance, I negotiate on gender and climate change, and sometimes you find some countries don't have delegates even in that negotiation group. So we need to create more awareness and also make sure that the gender question is emphasized in all ways. I think one of the strategies that we can look at for the women and youth now is to increase capacity building. You will realize that negotiation is not easy, and it needs people to get that expertise. So there is need for national governments and for parties and any development and institutions, entity to emphasize the issue of building the capacity of the youth and the women so that they participate effectively in the negotiation. If we do that, then we should be able to have a quality output from the negotiations.
Great, thank you very much. So our next question is for Martien, and this is in light of the current crisis that we're all experiencing. How can we ensure that fundamental changes to policies, institutions, and incentives are part of efforts to build back better after the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because what you see is that COVID-19 is actually accentuating and amplifying many of the weaknesses and the challenges of the global food system. I mean, think of the zoonotic nature of the pandemic. I mean, that actually reflects, the encroachment of agricultural natural habitats. Think about the link between, poor diets, compromised immune systems, and pre-existing conditions, and COVID-19 morbidity. So clearly there are a link as well. Look at the disruptions of the food supply chains, indicating their vulnerability. And also, of course, COVID-19 is compounding, existing problems. like locust outbreak in Africa, as well as drought and water. But the global food system still needs to feed 9.8 billion people by 2050. We still need to reduce the carbon footprint. Those challenges are not going to go away Well, at the same time, COVID-19 is putting us back. So making those challenges that are already enormous even more challenging. So in that sense, there is no alternative. I mean, to go beyond business as usual and really think about building back better. What I think, and going back to the discussion here about public support, I mean, to agriculture, the 570 billion, what I expect and what we're already seeing in our engagements with client governments, they're coming to us for advice, is that because of the economic impact of COVID-19 is causing a lot of fiscal stress on public expenditures. So that's actually forcing governments, I mean, to take a hard look at their existing public support programs across all the sectors, including agriculture. So I think in that sense, there really is an opportunity for building back better and actually putting this much higher on the agenda. Never waste a good crisis. And I think, you know, repurposing public support for all the reasons I pointed out, I mean, would be a very good opportunity to move that agenda forward. And what I say, there's a lot of interest in our countries. They're actually coming to us. It's not that we are making that point to our clients. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think we have time for one quick question for each panelist left in this part of the session. So my next question goes back to Martin Frick. The report calls for subsidy and policy reform. So the question is, will the Food Systems Summit address these issues in food systems to catalyze action on the ground?
Indeed, we will be working on 5 action tracks, which we have framed in a way that they don't end up in the next silos. And the question of subsidies and you know, finance in general is a broad one, where I think the holistic lens that the summit is going to apply will be particularly helpful, because all of these subsidies have once been introduced with best intentions to get specific outcomes. And, you know, maybe if we can go back to the desired outcomes and look at these subsidies and basically say, is there a better way to achieve that? Is that still making sense? Did we forget climate change, energy use, all of, you know, biodiversity loss? Did we forget that in our equation? And, you know, on a country level, I would really hope that we can trigger this conversations and basically go back to a purpose-driven policy and, you know, a reality check whether that still works in the 21st century or how it needs to be realigned to be in line with the obtainment of the 2030 agenda.
Thank you. Thank you. One last question for Winnie before we move on to the final question. And that question is, in your experience, do you feel that in the region, women and youth feel that their governments are listening to them? Is there progress in that area? And what steps can be taken to amplify their voice?
I think to a great extent, there has been, governments have had commitments. They've committed to international obligations of gender balance and gender equality. But certainly there is the level of implementation of some of those commitments is not to the standard. There is a big effort, especially in the issue of women empowerment. But I must say that I think governments are overwhelmed by the youth, because the youth now in many African countries, for example, they form the biggest percentage of the population. And I think most governments were not prepared for this kind of badge. So I feel that there is need to do much more in the area of the youth empowerment and involvement in the different activities. So although there is some progress on the gender and women empowerment, but I think when it comes to the youth programs, there's a lot to be desired. And governments need to put in programs to make sure that their concerns are listened to and taken in consideration.
Sorry, great, thank you very much. We have just 1 minute left. So I'm going to ask one final question to Martien, and I'm going to ask a very big question that you need to answer in less than a minute. So I hope you don't mind. And the question is, globally, what are the good practices on implementing policies and laws to secure sustainable farming?
Yes. So if you want to do transformative change, and we've had a few projects where we did it, where we are doing it, I would put forward two crucial elements. One is to take into account the political economy of things. I mean, there is a reason why those $570 billion in subsidies and public support are there, as Martien was saying. And very often they're political. So there are very sound economic reasons for repurposing. But if you don't bring in the political economy dimension, it is very difficult to pull it off. I mean, so you have to be very explicit about it. You need champions at the highest level. That's one. The other thing is communications, and particularly the ability to explain to farmers why this repurposing of public support is in their best interest and actually supports the money in their wallet, and why actually repurposing is in their economic interest. So I always tell the ministers, we need to be able to explain to a farmer what it means. I mean, when we repurpose, public support, and if you can make that case to the farmers, that's another very important dimension of making this happen. So,
great, thank you very much. So this part, I'll pass on to Ruben. Thank you very much to all the panelists for your very interesting comments, and thanks very much to the audience for the very interesting questions. Over to you.
Thank you, Sophia. So to wrap up, I don't have a long speech. Don't worry, just a couple of minutes on a few points that we just discussed. So I have three of those points. One is that we need to stay focused because of sometimes I joke about my advanced age. I've seen many reports and several summits and many other initiatives, but at the end, there are quite a bit of them, and then we need to stay focused to really get results. So these three outcomes that we are discussing today in this panel, we need to achieve them. I mean, I don't think there is a way back. We need to reform subsidies, to think about policies. We need to access markets, improve, and reduce trade barriers. And for that, we need much more advocacy and new coalitions, as you can see throughout the fantastic discussion we've been having all day in the launching of this report. So that's one. We need to stay focused on those outcomes because there are too many things going on out there. And the second one is to stay focused on the three targets, because one of the reasons why I still believe this is a fantastic report, it has targets that it could be achieved. So if we go back to the answers of the panel today, how to reduce or transform or realign those 300 or 600 billion, if we can improve the business environment, because without private sector and without businesses, we are not going to achieve it. And if we can improve resilience on some countries that are not there, those are three very important targets. And my final point is that for all of this, I think we will need research, and we will need international public research. And I hope that when the CGR rethinks the portfolio of research for the future of CICAS, after 10 glorious years of good evidence providing on these issues, I hope the CGR includes all of these topics that we've been discussing all morning and the rest of the afternoon in the research portfolio, so the CGR can continue to provide evidence for all of these targets and outcomes to happen. So with that, that's kind of my little summary. I have an announcement that I've been asked from the organizers, that to please, if you want the conversation to keep going, there is a Twitter account there on the hashtag new era for food that you can keep active there. We are going to take a 15-minute break for the next session. And now all of this that we talk in this panel is going to be solved in the next panel. So you have to stay tuned, because the next panel is going to unlock the billions from sustainable finance to finance all the things that we've been saying. So with that, thank you very much. And I hope you can read the report and we can work all together to implement it. Thank you very much. Thank you.